HOA fine. Pay it to Nengudoker.
This is a fraud, officer.
The red and blue lights danced across Nick's truck as he watched the law knock on his neighbor's perfect little kingdom. This wasn't about anger, it was about justice, a reminder that even the loudest bully crumbles when the law finally pushes back. This is a story of pride, downfall, and the fragile foundations of false power. Hit like, subscribe for more powerful stories, and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Nick's life had a rhythm as reliable as the sunrise over his lake. He was a man who appreciated simple, sturdy things, the heft of a well-made wrench in his hand, the solid clunk of his truck door, the smell of sawdust and old oil in his workshop. For 35 years, he'd run a successful electrical contracting business, a company built on his own two hands, his reputation for honesty, and a profound understanding of how things connect and flow. When he finally retired, handing the reins over to his son, he hadn't slowed down. Instead, he'd been cajoled by friends and neighbors, men and women he'd known his whole life, to run for mayor of their small, tight-knit town. He won, not because he was a slick politician, he hated politics, but because he was Nick. He was the man you called when your wiring went haywire, the man who'd show up on a Sunday to fix a faulty generator at the town hall, the man who spoke in plain terms about budgets and infrastructure. He was practical, grounded, and possessed a quiet authority that came from competence, not ego. His sanctuary, the place where the title of mayor fell away, was his property, a 10-acre slice of heaven he'd bought for a song when he was just a young man, long before the surrounding farmland had been carved up into a subdivision of cookie-cutter McMansions they called the Shores at Whisper Lake. The crown jewel of his property was the lake itself, not Whisper Lake. That was a marketing name invented by a developer. To Nick, it was just the lake. It was a 5-acre spring-fed body of water entirely contained within his property lines. His grandfather had taught him to fish there. He'd taught his own son to swim in its cool, clear water. The property, with its modest, sturdy brick house he'd built himself, and the large workshop that housed a lifetime of tools and projects, was his heritage. It was the physical manifestation of a life of hard work. The new neighborhood that bordered his eastern fence was a source of mild amusement to him. The houses were enormous, packed tightly together, and their owners seemed to be in a constant, unspoken competition over who had the greenest lawn or the newest luxury SUV. He didn't mind them. He was a live and let live kind of man. He kept his fence line clear, gave a friendly wave when he drove past, and generally kept to himself. He cherished the peace, the sound of the wind in the old-growth pines that ringed his water, the call of the loons at dusk. He had no idea that his quiet life was about to be targeted by a woman who saw his peace not as something to be respected, but as something to be conquered. Martha moved into the biggest house in the Shores, the one right on the property line overlooking his lake. About a year ago. Nick knew the type. He'd seen them come and go over the years. New money, desperate to be seen as old money. She drove a white Range Rover, wore tennis whites as if they were a uniform, and spoke with a practiced, airy condescension that set his teeth on edge. Their first and only real conversation had been a few weeks after she moved in. She'd flagged him down as he was driving out of his gate. "Excuse me," she'd said, not making eye contact, instead looking at his dusty work truck with disdain. "I'm Martha, your new neighbor." She'd gestured vaguely towards his lake. "We're forming a new homeowners association for the lakefront properties, and we'll be distributing the covenant and fee schedule shortly. We're going to really elevate the aesthetic of this community." Nick had just smiled, a slow, easy smile. "Mum, that's fine for you all, but this property, including the lake, isn't part of your subdivision. It's private land, has been for nearly a century." He thought that was clear enough. He was wrong. Her eyes had narrowed almost imperceptibly. "We'll see about that," she'd murmured, turning on her heel before he could respond. It was a declaration of war, but Nick, in his peaceful world, hadn't recognized the sound of the first shot being fired. The first notice appeared on a Tuesday. It was tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck, which was parked well within his own property, a good 50 feet from his front door. He thought it was a flyer at first. It was printed on cheap, cream-colored paper, the kind you buy in a discount pack. The top of the page read, in an obnoxious flowing script font, "The Shores at Whisper Lake Homeowners Association." Below that, in a bold, capitalized font, "Official Notice of Violation." He felt a prickle of annoyance. He read the details. Violation. Unauthorized. Recreational swimming. Fine. 50. There was a little box at the bottom for payment remittance, with an address listed Martha's address. Nick stared at it for a long moment, the absurdity of it washing over him. Unauthorized swimming. In his own lake. A lake that was as much a part of him as his own memories. He let out a short, sharp laugh. It was so utterly ridiculous. It was almost funny. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the cheap material crackling in protest, and tossed it into the recycling bin in his workshop. He figured it was a joke, or perhaps the first salvo from a deeply confused and entitled woman. He chose to ignore it, believing that engaging with such foolishness would only give it oxygen. That was his second mistake. He underestimated the boundless energy of a petty tyrant with too much time on her hands. A week later, the second notice arrived. This one wasn't left on his truck. It came in the mail, in a crisp white envelope, with the same gaudy "Shores at Whisper Lake" Hoa letterhead printed on it. The postage was correct, and the address was right. Someone had gone to the trouble of making this look official. His annoyance started to curdle into something harder, colder. He slit the envelope open with a blade from his workbench. The format was the same, but the violation had changed. Violation. Improper boat. Usage. Non-sanctioned watercraft. The fine was now 100. He looked out the window at the small aluminum fishing boat tied to his dock, a boat his father had bought him for his 16th birthday. It was dented and scarred from decades of use, and each mark told a story. Non-sanctioned. The word was an insult. It implied there was an authority, a sanctioning body, that had any say in what he did on his own land. This was no longer just foolishness. This was harassment. He walked from his workshop to the small office in his house that he used for mayoral business. As a formality, he called the city clerk's office. "Cheryl," he said, "it's Nick. Quick question for you. Can you run a search for any registered homeowners associations under the name The Shores at Whisper Lake?" He could hear her typing. After a moment, she came back. "Nope. Nothing registered with the city, Nick. Or the county, for that matter. As far as official records go, it doesn't exist." Nick thanked her and hung up. So, it was a complete fiction. A fantasy of power Martha had invented. He shredded the second notice, the thin strips of paper falling like confetti into his wastebasket. He still believed ignoring it was the best course of action. He was a patient man, and he figured she'd eventually get bored and move on to harassing someone else. His patience was a finite resource, and Martha seemed determined to exhaust it. The third notice arrived 4 days later, and with it came a direct confrontation. He was down by the dock, mending a fishing net, when he heard her voice, sharp and grating, slice through the peaceful morning air. "Mr. Henderson." He didn't turn around at first, pretending he hadn't heard. "I know you can hear me, Mr. Henderson. Do not ignore me." He sighed, placing his tools down carefully before slowly turning to face her. She was standing just on her side of his fence, dressed in her usual pristine athletic wear, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was holding another one of her cream-colored envelopes. "You've received 3 notices from the association now, and you have failed to remit payment," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is your final warning before we escalate." Nick leaned against a fence post, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm and even, "there is no association. You made it up, and you are trespassing every time you leave one of these silly notes on my property. I suggest you stop." A humorless smile touched her lips. "Oh, it's very real, I assure you, and you are in violation. This notice is for failure to comply with association directives, plus your previous outstanding fines. Your total is now $400. She slid the envelope through the fence. Nick didn't move to take it. And if you fail to pay within 7 business days, she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening whisper, the association will have no choice but to place a lien on your property. That was it. The word lien, the threat against his property, his home, the legacy he'd built with his own hands. In that single moment, something inside Nick shifted. The amused tolerance, the patient dismissal, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This woman wasn't just an annoyance anymore. She wasn't just a misguided busybody. She was a threat. She had crossed a line that, in Nick's world, was sacred. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw past the expensive clothes and the arrogant posture. He saw a bully, pure and simple. A person who derived pleasure from wielding power she didn't possess over people she felt were beneath her. And he, the mayor of this town, a man who had sworn an oath to uphold its laws and protect its citizens, was not about to let a bully threaten his home with fraudulent documents and phantom authority. He finally straightened up from the fence post. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Martha, he said, and the use of her first name, spoken with such steely quiet, seemed to startle her. You have just made a very, very serious mistake. He turned his back on her, leaving the envelope lying in the grass, and walked back towards his house. The war she had declared was finally on, but it wasn't going to be fought with petty notices and empty threats. It was going to be fought with the full, unyielding weight of the law, and Nick was going to make sure she felt every single ounce of it. Back in his office, the quiet, methodical part of his brain took over. The part that could look at a complex electrical schematic and see the clear, logical path of the current. He saw this situation no differently. Martha was the faulty wiring, a dangerous short circuit in the community, and he needed to trace her connections, find the source of her malfunction, and safely, legally, shut her down. The first thing he did was retrieve the envelope she had left. He handled it carefully, using a pair of tweezers from his workshop. He was now treating this as evidence. The threat of a lien was a serious escalation. It moved beyond simple harassment and into the realm of attempted fraud and extortion. He placed the envelope and its contents into a clear plastic bag and labeled it with the date and time. His next call was to David, the city attorney. David was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer in his late 40s who shared Nick's distaste for bureaucratic overreach. Nick explained the situation in precise, chronological detail. From the first notice to the verbal threat of a lien. He could hear David tapping on his keyboard as he spoke. When Nick finished, there was a long pause. Okay, Nick, David said finally, his voice grim. This is more than just a neighborhood squabble. A non-existent entity threatening a property lien is a clear-cut case of attempted fraud. The documents themselves could be considered forgery, depending on how a judge looks at it. This is a criminal matter. That's what I thought, Nick said. So what's our first move? A cease? David chuckled dryly. A cease is a polite request. This woman sounds like she's immune to politeness. No, we need to go further. First, I want you to file a formal police report for harassment and attempted fraud. Get a case number. Document every interaction. Keep every piece of mail she sends you. Create a paper trail so thick she could drown in it. Nick was already writing it down. Done, he said. What's next? Next, David continued. We do our own due diligence. You said she's running this association out of her house. She listed her home address as the payment remittance location. That's right, Nick confirmed. Interesting, David mused. That brings up a whole host of other potential issues. Zoning, business licenses, tax implications, you know, the boring, procedural stuff that people like her think they're too important to bother with. A slow smile spread across Nick's face. He knew exactly where David was going. The current was flowing, and he could see the entire circuit now. David, he said, I think it's time I made a few official inquiries with our city departments. As mayor, of course. Just ensuring all our residents are in full compliance with municipal codes. He could practically hear David's grin through the phone. I think that's a wonderful, civic-minded idea, Mr. Mayor. Let me know what you find. The next morning, Nick drove to the town hall. He didn't go to the mayor's office. Instead, he went to the records department in the basement, a place filled with the smell of old paper and the quiet hum of servers. He greeted the clerk, a woman who had worked for the city for 40 years, and made his request. He wanted to see the public records for Martha's property address, zoning permits, building permits, any registered business licenses, everything. As he waited, he made his second stop, the police station. He sat down with the chief of police, Frank, a man he'd known since kindergarten. Frank was a big man with a calm demeanor who had seen it all. Nick laid out the plastic bag with the notice inside. He explained the situation calmly and factually. Frank listened intently, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When Nick mentioned the lien, Frank let out a low whistle. That's felony territory, Nick. Attempted grand larceny by extortion, possibly. This isn't just a cranky neighbor. He took Nick's statement personally and assigned a case number on the spot. We'll open an investigation, Frank assured him. But keep your distance. Let her make the next move. Bullies like this, they always overplay their hand. Nick agreed, thanked him, and headed back to the records department. The clerk had a thin file waiting for him. There were building permits for a deck and a kitchen remodel, standard stuff. But under the section for business licenses or home occupation permits, there was nothing. A blank page. Nick took a copy of the file and went to his last stop of the day, the city's finance and tax office. He presented the file to the head of the department, a meticulous accountant named Brenda. Brenda, he said, I have a question about this address. Can you tell me if there's a business registered here for tax purposes, state or local? Brenda, a woman who found beauty in a perfectly balanced ledger, typed the address into her system. Her eyebrows shot up. No, Mr. Mayor. No business tax ID is associated with this address. The property is zoned Roan residential, single-family home. Is there a reason you're asking? Nick leaned forward slightly. I have reason to believe an unregistered, unlicensed consulting business is being operated from this location. Brenda's expression hardened. Her department was responsible for collecting the revenue that kept the city running, the money that paved the roads and paid the firefighters. Tax evasion wasn't just a crime to her, it was a personal insult. An illegal home business, she clarified, her voice dangerously quiet. That would mean they haven't paid a single cent in local business and occupation taxes, and they're almost certainly not compliant with Home Office zoning regulations. She began typing furiously, pulling up city ordinances. Oh, yes, she said, a grim satisfaction in her tone. This would be a significant violation. Multiple significant violations, in fact. The trap was beginning to take shape. Martha, in her arrogant attempt to fabricate authority over Nick's property, had inadvertently pointed a massive legal spotlight directly at her own. Before taking any official action, Nick wanted to do some old-fashioned groundwork. His next visit was to George, his oldest neighbor. George lived on the other side of Nick's property, in a small, well-kept house his father had built. At 85, George had seen the whole area transform from farmland to suburbia. He sat on his front porch, sipping iced tea, and listened as Nick recounted the saga with Martha. George just nodded slowly, a knowing, weary look in his eyes. That one, George said, shaking his head. She's a piece of work. Been that way since the day she moved in. He told Nick how Martha had tried to have the town cut down a 200-year-old oak tree on the edge of the park because it obstructed her afternoon. Son. He mentioned how she'd reported another neighbor to animal control because their dog, a friendly old golden retriever, barked when the mailman came. She's a control freak, son. Always has been. Thinks her money and her big house make her queen of the neighborhood. Then George leaned in, his voice lower. A few of the other folks over in the shores have gotten notes from her HOA too. One fella was told his garden gnomes were non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. Another was fined because their basketball hoop was visible from the street. Most of them are too scared of her to say anything. They just pay the silly fines to make her go away. This was the piece of information Nick needed. It wasn't just him, Martha was running a neighborhood-wide extortion racket. This new information changed the calculus. It was no longer a personal dispute. This was a matter of public concern. Nick spent the next few days speaking quietly with the other neighbors George had mentioned. At first, they were hesitant, fearful of retaliation from Martha. But when they realized the mayor himself was investigating, their stories started to tumble out. One woman showed him a fine of $25 because her recycling bin was left out 2 hours past the designated pickup time. A young couple was threatened with a fine for the unapproved color of their daughter's swing set. Each story was more ludicrous than the last. Nick collected copies of their fake notices, each one meticulously documented and added to the growing file. He was building a comprehensive case, not just of harassment against him, but of a pattern of systemic intimidation and fraud targeting multiple residents. He assured each of them that their testimony would be kept confidential until the time was right and that the city would protect them. For the first time, these bullied residents saw a glimmer of hope. They saw that someone was finally willing to stand up to the Queen of the Shores. The rallied community was forming. A silent army waiting for their general to give the signal. Nick felt the weight of their trust on his shoulders, and it only strengthened his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his lake anymore. He was fighting for his whole community. With the evidence from the neighbors, the lack of city permits, the confirmation of tax evasion, and the ongoing police investigation, Nick had all the ammunition he needed. He convened a meeting with David, the city attorney, and Frank, the chief of police. He laid out the entire file on the conference table in his office. The collection of cream-colored notices, the sworn statements from other residents, and the reports from the tax and zoning departments. It was a mountain of evidence, a testament to Martha's arrogance. "She's running a racket," Frank said, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's small time, but the pattern of intimidation is textbook." David reviewed the documents from the tax office and code enforcement. "Legally," he said, "we have her dead to rights. Operating a business without a license, failure to pay municipal taxes, and multiple zoning code violations for running a commercial enterprise out of a residential zoned property. Each of these carries a significant fine, and the tax office can, and will, go after her for all unpaid back taxes, plus penalties and interest." Nick looked at them both. "So we have two paths here. The criminal complaint for the harassment and attempted fraud, and the civil and administrative violations for the illegal business. How do we proceed?" "So, we proceed on all fronts simultaneously," David said with a sharp grin. "We coordinate. Code enforcement serves her with a cease and desist order for the business. The tax office delivers a notice of delinquency and an audit warrant. And the police? Frank, you can have an officer accompany them to ensure the peace is kept while official city business is conducted." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. It was a coordinated, multi-departmental takedown, executed entirely by the book. There would be no shouting match over a fence, no dramatic confrontation. Nick would not be the one to serve her the papers. The city would do it. It was impersonal, methodical, and utterly unstoppable. This was the system working as it should, protecting citizens from those who believe the rules don't apply to them. Frank agreed to assign two of his most stoic, unflappable officers to the detail. Brenda from the tax office was practically giddy at the prospect of delivering the audit notice herself. The head of code enforcement, a stern man named Mike, prepared the cease and desist order, citing a half-dozen separate ordinance violations. They decided to execute the plan the following Tuesday, late in the afternoon, a time when they could be sure Martha would be home. Nick felt a sense of grim satisfaction. It was like planning a complex wiring job. He had identified the problem, drawn up the schematic, gathered the materials, and now, all that was left was to flip the switch. He would not be there in an official capacity. He was the victim in the police report after all. But he decided he would be nearby. He wanted to see the final connection made. He wanted to witness the moment the lights finally went out on Martha's reign of terror. The days leading up to Tuesday were quiet. No new notices appeared. Nick imagined Martha was stewing, wondering why he hadn't responded to her lean threat. Likely interpreting his silence as fear or submission. He let her believe it. He spent the time on his lake, fishing, the familiar rhythm of casting and reeling calming his nerves. He thought about his grandfather, a man who taught him that the best way to deal with a bully wasn't to sink to their level, but to use their own momentum against them. Martha had been pushing and pushing, building up a head of steam, and Nick had simply stepped aside and opened a door for her, a door that led directly off a cliff. He felt no malice, only a sense of profound, righteous justice. She had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and the slightest, most well-aimed puff of wind was about to bring it all down. On Tuesday afternoon, he got a text from Frank. "We're green. 1,600 hours." At 10 minutes to 4, Nick left his house and drove his truck to a quiet spot down the street from Martha's home, a place with a clear line of sight. He poured a cup of coffee from his thermos and waited. It felt, in a strange way, like the moments before a big storm, a stillness in the air pregnant with energy. At precisely 4:00 p.m., the convoy arrived. It was even more impressive than Nick had imagined. 2 police cruisers, the white code enforcement van, and a sedan from the city tax office. They didn't use their sirens, pulling up quietly and parking with practiced efficiency. Nick watched as the 2 officers, Chief Frank himself, and the heads of the 2 other departments got out of their vehicles. They conferred for a moment on the sidewalk, a small huddle of civic authority. Then, as one, they started up the slate pathway to Martha's front door. The doorbell chimed, a pleasant melodic sound that was utterly at odds with the legal devastation about to be unleashed. The door swung open, and there she was. Even from a distance, Nick could see the look of indignant surprise on her face, quickly followed by a flash of anger. He couldn't hear what was being said, but he could see her gesticulating wildly, her body language radiating arrogance and disbelief. She was probably demanding to know who they were, threatening to call her lawyer and telling them they had no right. He watched as the code enforcement officer calmly handed her a thick packet of paper. Then the woman from the tax office handed her another. Chief Frank just stood there, his arms crossed, a silent, immovable symbol of the law. The scene he had pictured was playing out exactly as planned. The confrontation on the doorstep, as observed by Nick from afar, lasted for nearly 15 minutes. Martha's initial blustering seemed to falter as she began to read the documents in her hand. Nick could imagine her eyes scanning the legal jargon. The bolded words, cease and desist, a failure to comply, tax delinquency, immediate audit. The color must have been draining from her face. This wasn't a $50 fine for swimming in a lake. This was the full, crushing weight of municipal and state law. This was real. He saw her point a finger at Chief Frank, her mouth moving rapidly. Frank simply shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. He was explaining, no doubt, that he was merely there to keep the peace while official city business was conducted, and that if she failed to cooperate, she would be obstructing a government operation, which came with its own set of very serious consequences. Her shoulders slumped. The fight went out of her. The self-appointed queen had been dethroned not by a peasant revolt, but by the quiet, unassailable power of the codes and statutes she thought were only for other people. She took the papers, gave them one last withering glare, and slammed the door. The city officials turned and walked calmly back to their vehicles, their jobs done. As they drove away, Nick took one last look at the big, faux Tuscan house. It suddenly looked smaller, less imposing. It was just a house, and inside was just a woman who had learned a hard lesson. He started his truck and drove home. The aftermath was both swift and silent. The shores at Whisper Lake, HOA, vanished overnight. The condescending notices stopped. The neighborhood chatter, which Nick heard about second-hand from a grateful George, was that Martha had become a recluse. The white Range Rover was rarely seen, and she no longer held court by her manicured lawn. The city's actions had completely neutered her. The cease and desist order meant she could no longer operate her consulting business from her home. Without that income, and facing a massive bill for years of unpaid business taxes, plus fines and penalties that David later told him were in the 5-figure range, her financial situation became precarious. The tax audit was, by all accounts, a nightmare for her. Investigators, armed with a warrant, had the right to go through all of her financial records, uncovering every undeclared dollar. Her kingdom of lies had been built on a foundation of tax fraud, and it was now being systematically dismantled by Brenda's meticulous accountants. The criminal investigation for harassment and attempted fraud was still open. David advised the D.A. office to hold on to it, to keep it as leverage. Martha, facing financial ruin, had no fight left in her. She was, for the first time in a long time, powerless. About 3 months after the visit from the city, a for sale sign appeared on Martha's lawn. It was a discreet, high-end realty sign, but it was a sign of total defeat nonetheless. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The tyrant was abdicating her throne. A collective sigh of relief seemed to settle over the entire subdivision. People started putting their garden gnomes back out. The family with the brightly colored swing set no longer felt the need to look over their shoulders. The fear she had cultivated was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. The neighbors, bonded by their shared experience, began talking to each other more. They even organized a real neighborhood potluck, not an association, meeting with rules and regulations, but a genuine get-together. Nick was invited as the guest of honor. He politely declined the title, but he did show up with a cooler full of fresh-caught bass from his lake, which he grilled for everyone. He listened as people laughed and shared stories, their freedom palpable. He had simply wanted to protect his own peace, but in doing so, he had brought peace to dozens of other families. It was a reminder that standing up to a bully, even a small one, can have an impact that ripples far beyond your own fence line. A new family bought Martha's house. They were a young couple with 2 small children, and the first thing they did was introduce themselves to Nick. They admired his property and asked if he'd be willing to teach their son how to fish in the lake sometime. Nick smiled, a genuine, warm smile, and said he'd be delighted. The border between his old-world property and the new subdivision no longer felt like a battle line. It was just a fence, and on both sides were good people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. Nick's life returned to its familiar, comfortable rhythm. The sun rose over his lake, the loons called at dusk, and his workshop was filled with the familiar smells of oil and wood. He continued his work as mayor, dealing with the real, practical problems of running a town, fixing potholes, balancing budgets, and planning for the future, but he never forgot the lesson Martha had taught him. He had learned that true authority isn't about fancy titles or fabricated rules. It comes from integrity, from knowing the law, and from having the quiet courage to enforce it when someone, no matter how wealthy or self-important, decides they are above it all. He had won, not by shouting louder, but by being smarter, more patient, and more resolute. And his victory was shared by the entire community, a quiet triumph that tasted as sweet and satisfying as the cool, clear water of his own private lake. Looking back, Nick realized the irony was the most delicious part of the whole affair. Martha, in her obsessive quest to control a piece of property that wasn't hers, had lost her own. Her desire to project an image of wealth and power was shattered by the discovery that her wealth was built on the illegal foundation of tax evasion. Every weapon she had tried to use against him, bogus legal documents, financial threats, an air of untouchable authority had been turned back on her with the simple, undeniable force of the actual law. She had tried to fine him for swimming in his lake, and in return, the city had effectively shut down her entire life's operation. It was a perfect, almost poetic, reversal of fortune. She had picked a fight with a quiet, retired electrician, never bothering to find out that he was also the mayor. She assumed he was just some old man she could push around, a relic from a time before her glorious community aesthetic arrived. She had misjudged her opponent on every conceivable level, a fatal error in any conflict, and the community she had sought to rule with an iron fist had blossomed the moment she was gone, proving that her brand of leadership was not only unwanted but entirely unnecessary. The peace that settled over the neighborhood was her true legacy, a peace defined entirely by her absence. The story became something of a local legend. It was told in hushed, amused tones at the diner and the hardware store. It was a David and Goliath story for the modern suburban age. The tale of the quiet mayor who took down the HOA queen without ever raising his voice. Nick, for his part, never spoke of it publicly. When asked, he'd just say it was a municipal code compliance issue that has since been resolved. He took no pleasure in Martha's ruin, but he took immense satisfaction in the restoration of order and justice. His professional allies, David and Frank, would sometimes bring it up over a beer, marveling at the sheer, unmitigated arrogance of the woman. They used it as a training example for recruits and junior attorneys, a perfect case study in how to dismantle a problem patiently and methodically, using the tools the system provides. It was a testament to the fact that you don't need to be a bully to beat a bully. You just need to be smarter, more prepared, and have the law firmly on your side. Nick's reputation in the town, already solid, was cemented. He was the man who had brought down the tyrant next door, the protector of the common citizen, the blue-collar philosopher king who ruled not from a throne, but from the driver's seat of a dusty pickup truck with a thermos of black coffee and an unshakable sense of what was right. Nick often found himself down by the dock in the early mornings, watching the mist burn off the surface of the water. This place was his heart, his history, his peace. Martha had tried to take that, to monetize it, to regulate it, to wrap it in her cheap, cream-colored notices and bureaucratic nonsense. She had failed to understand that some things cannot be bought or controlled. A person's heritage, their connection to a piece of land, the quiet dignity of a life well lived, these were things that existed outside her shallow world of status and appearances. He thought about the new family next door, the sound of their children's laughter, now a frequent and welcome addition to the lakeside soundscape. He had, in fact, taken their young son fishing. He'd shown him how to bait a hook, how to cast a line, how to feel the subtle tug of a hungry bass. As he watched the boy's eyes light up with the thrill of his first catch, Nick felt a deep and abiding sense of contentment. This was what the lake was for, not for rules and regulations, but for sharing, for teaching, for the creation of new memories. Martha's aggression had inadvertently reminded him of how precious his peace truly was, and in defending it, he had ensured that it would be preserved for a new generation. The battle was long over, the victory was absolute, and the peace that followed was the greatest trophy of all. As time went on, the rallied community became more than just a group of former victims. They formed a legitimate neighborhood watch, not to enforce aesthetic standards, but to look out for one another. They organized block parties, helped elderly neighbors with yard work, and created a phone tree for emergencies. The toxic environment of fear and judgment that Martha had cultivated was replaced with one of genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. The very community she had tried to create through intimidation was now flourishing precisely because of her absence. It was the ultimate proof of how misguided her entire philosophy had been. She believed that control and power were what held a community together, when in reality, it was kindness, cooperation, and a shared sense of belonging. The basketball hoop that had been a source of fun was now the centerpiece of neighborhood pickup games. The garden gnomes, once declared non-compliant, now stood as tiny, cheerful symbols of their collective freedom. Nick would sometimes see these small acts of defiance and community building and allow himself a small, satisfied smile. He hadn't just removed a problem. He had created the space for something much better to grow in its place. The entire ordeal had been a catalyst for positive change, a painful but ultimately necessary process of lancing a boil to allow the community to heal. Nick's interaction with the police department throughout the process solidified a deep, mutual respect. Chief Frank often remarked that it was the most well-documented and cleanly executed civilian complaint he had ever seen. Nick's methodical approach, logging every interaction, preserving evidence, and speaking to witnesses, had made their job straightforward. When the time came for official action, the police weren't acting on a vague, he said, she said, complaint. They were supporting other city departments in the enforcement of airtight legal and civil violations. This was crucial. It kept the police in a position of impartial authority, preventing any accusations that the mayor was using the department as his personal army. Frank appreciated Nick's understanding of procedure and his respect for the chain of command. The officers who had accompanied the officials to Martha's door later told Nick that she had threatened to sue them all. To have their badges, they had remained professional and stoic, just as they were trained to do, because they knew the law was on their side. The case reinforced the importance of proper procedure and interdepartmental cooperation, strengthening the working relationships between the mayor's office, the police, and the city's administrative branches. It was a quiet victory for good governance, as much as it was a personal one for Nick. The role of the wise elder, George, proved to be more pivotal than Nick had initially realized. It was George who provided the initial context for Martha's behavior, confirming that she was not just a nuisance, but a serial harasser. More importantly, it was George who gave Nick the names of the other victims. Without that crucial piece of information, Nick's case would have been a singular complaint. With it, it became a pattern of racketeering. George had been the community's historian, the keeper of its grievances. He had been too old and too tired to fight Martha himself, but he recognized in Nick a man who had the will and the means to do so. He became the catalyst, the spark that lit the fuse of the investigation. After Martha was gone, many of the neighbors made a point to thank George, acknowledging that he was the one who had quietly connected the dots and pointed the way. George, in his humble way, would just shrug and say, "A rotten apple will spoil the whole barrel if you don't toss it out." His wisdom, born of long observation, had provided the moral and strategic foundation for the entire operation. He was the quiet hero of the story, the one who knew when to speak up and who to speak to. The professional ally, City Attorney David, was the architect of the legal strategy. Where Nick had the righteous indignation and the evidence, David had the legal blueprint. He was the one who saw the path beyond a simple harassment claim and into the far more damaging territory of zoning violations and tax fraud. He had guided Nick on how to build the case brick by brick, ensuring every step was legally sound and defensible. David's expertise was in turning Martha's own bureaucratic weapons against her. She loved official-looking documents, so David buried her in real ones. She loved citing rules and regulations, so he found the dozen she was actually breaking. He operated with the precision of a surgeon, identifying the legal vulnerabilities and exploiting them ruthlessly. His role was a perfect example of how a citizen, even a mayor, should work with the legal system. Nick wasn't a vigilante. He was a client. He presented the facts, and David provided the legal framework for action. Their partnership was a powerful combination of Nick's common-sense justice and David's deep knowledge of the law. Together, they had ensured that Martha's takedown was not just satisfying, but legally unimpeachable. It was a victory for the system, proving that when used correctly, it is more than a match for those who try to subvert it for their own petty ends. The humor of the situation was never lost on Nick. It was a dark, ironic humor, the kind that makes you shake your head and chuckle at the sheer absurdity of human behavior. The idea of a woman creating a fake government to fine a man who ran the real government was something out of a satirical novel. He found it endlessly amusing that Martha's consulting business, likely a source of immense pride and a tool for her to feel superior to others, was the very thing that brought her down. She was so focused on policing his life that she never stopped to consider if her own was in order. It was the classic case of the pot calling the kettle black, except the pot was also illegally built, not up to code, and had never paid its taxes. The downfall was so complete, so self-inflicted, that it bordered on farcical. The image of her standing on her multi-thousand-dollar slate pathway, dressed in expensive athletic wear, being served a cease and desist for running an illegal business, was a masterclass in irony. Nick never laughed in her face, but in the quiet of his workshop, he sometimes allowed himself a deep, rumbling laugh at the sheer poetic foolishness of it all. The bully had been defeated not by a bigger fist, but by her own staggering lack of self-awareness. The pacing of the conflict followed a classic arc of escalation. It began with a trivial annoyance, a piece of paper he could easily crumple and discard. It was a slow burn, a measured build-up of pressure. Each notice from Martha was a turn of the screw, tightening the tension. Nick's internal state shifted in lockstep with this escalation. His initial amusement gave way to annoyance, which then hardened into frustration, and finally, with the threat of the lien, it crystallized into cold, methodical determination. Once he decided to act, the pace quickened dramatically. The investigation phase was a rapid series of discoveries, each one more damning than the last. It was a cascade of information, a swift and efficient gathering of ammunition. The climax itself was a rapid, decisive strike. There was no prolonged battle, no lengthy court case. It was a single, coordinated event that ended the conflict in a matter of minutes. Then, the pace slowed once more for the resolution. The aftermath unfolded over months, a detailed and satisfying epilogue that showed the complete and total dismantling of Martha's power and the slow, steady healing of the community. This rhythmic escalation made the final victory all the more gratifying. It wasn't an impulsive act of anger. It was the inevitable, carefully planned conclusion to a conflict she had started and relentlessly fueled. Nick's first-person perspective, if he were to tell the story himself, would be grounded in his blue-collar philosophy. He would describe the feeling of the fake notice paper too light, not the proper weight of official documents. He'd talk about the condescending tone in Martha's voice, comparing it to the sound of a stripped gear. His internal monologue would be filled with practical analogies. He saw the investigation not as a legal battle, but as a complex rewiring job. He had to trace the faulty circuits of her operation, identify the shorts and the fire hazards, and then safely cut the power before the whole house burned down. He'd use metaphors of war and chess, not because he was a violent man, but because he understood strategy. Martha was playing checkers, making loud, obvious moves. He was playing chess, quietly positioning his pieces, the lawyer, the police chief, the tax office for a checkmate she never saw coming. His language would be simple, direct, and street-smart, but it would carry a surprising depth of thought. He would be the everyman hero. A man who preferred the company of tools to politicians, but who stepped up to wield the tools of government when his home and his principles were threatened. He would speak directly to the audience, making them feel like they were sitting with him in his workshop, listening to a story over a cup of coffee. The use of sensory details would be key to drawing the audience into Nick's world. The story wouldn't just be about fines and laws, it would be about the visceral feeling of having one's sanctuary threatened. He'd describe the smell of the lake in the morning, damp earth, pine needles, and clean water. He would contrast that with the cloying, artificial scent of Martha's perfume when she confronted him at the fence line. He'd talk about the solid feel of the oak tree he leaned against while talking to George, its rough bark, a connection to the long history of the land, the crunch of the city official's shoes on the slate pathway, the sharp, authoritative snap of the clipboard, the final, hollow thud of Martha's front door slamming shut. These sounds would be more powerful than any dialogue. These details would ground the story, making it feel real and immediate. The audience would feel the cold dread of the lean threat and the warm satisfaction of the final, peaceful morning on the lake. The visual cues would be implicit, painted with words that evoke a strong sense of place and atmosphere, allowing the listener to build the scene in their own mind, making the story a personal and immersive experience. Foreshadowing would be woven throughout the early parts of the narrative. Nick might recall a piece of advice his father, also a tradesman, gave him years ago. "Son, most problems, you can see 'em coming if you just look at the wiring. People who take shortcuts, who don't ground their work properly, they're the ones who start fires." This would directly foreshadow the discovery of Martha's illegal, ungrounded business practices. The wise elder, George, in his first conversation with Nick, could have made a passing comment like, "People who build their houses that big and that fast are usually hiding something in the basement." This would hint at the deeper, hidden issues within Martha's life that Nick would eventually uncover. Even Martha's own dialogue would be a form of foreshadowing. Her constant reliance on bogus, official-sounding language would be an ironic prelude to her being brought down by real, binding legal documents. These small, planted seeds would make the final resolution feel not just satisfying, but inevitable, as if all the pieces were clicking into place exactly as they were meant to. It would reinforce the theme that character is destiny, and Martha's character was a blueprint for her own destruction. The contrast between Nick's and Martha's dialogue styles would be a central element of the storytelling. Nick's spoken words would be few, but potent. When he finally confronted Martha at the fence, his words would be calm, direct, and heavy with unspoken meaning. "You have just made a very, very serious mistake." It's a simple sentence, but it carries the weight of his entire character. Most of his dialogue would be his internal narration, where his thoughts are more expansive and philosophical. In contrast, Martha's speech would be a torrent of empty, condescending jargon. She would use words like covenant, compliance, ordinance, and aesthetic, incorrectly, weaponizing a vocabulary she doesn't truly understand. Her dialogue would be filled with veiled threats and passive-aggressive pleasantries, such as, "It would be a shame if we had to take further steps, but the community standards must be upheld." This would instantly define her character for the audience. She is all surface, no substance. He is all substance, no surface. This fundamental opposition in their communication styles would mirror the larger conflict, the battle between authentic, earned authority and a fragile, fabricated illusion of it. The concept of irony would be the narrative's backbone. The central irony, of course, is that Martha's attempt to exert illegal control over Nick's property leads directly to the legal destruction of her own livelihood. She is the architect of her own demise. Another layer of irony is her obsession with aesthetics and appearances. Her house is a perfect, manicured facade, but it houses an illegal, fraudulent enterprise. She judges Nick for his older, more rustic property, yet his life and his business are built on a solid, legal, and moral foundation. The ultimate irony would be in the epilogue. The community she tried to create through force and intimidation only truly becomes a community after she is gone. Her actions, intended to bend the neighborhood to her will, end up being the catalyst that frees it from her influence and allows it to flourish. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's a story where the antagonist's own character flaws and actions create a perfectly tailored, inescapable trap for herself. The justice isn't just legal, it's poetic. Nick doesn't have to break a single rule to win. He just has to let Martha be herself, confident that her own arrogance will eventually be her undoing. The emotional arc of the story would take the listener on a complete vindication journey. It would start with a sense of peace and contentment, establishing Nick's idyllic life and making the audience feel protective of it. As Martha's harassment begins, the tone would shift to righteous indignation and rising tension. The audience would share Nick's growing frustration and feel the injustice of the situation. The period of investigation would be filled with suspense and methodical determination as the audience follows the trail of clues with Nick, feeling the thrill of each discovery that tightens the net around Martha. The climax would be a moment of pure, triumphant justice. The stress and tension would be released in a single, powerful scene of comeuppance. Finally, the epilogue would provide a deep sense of satisfaction and uplifting restoration. The listener would see the positive changes in the community, the return of peace to Nick's life, and the complete and total defeat of the antagonist. This carefully crafted emotional journey, from tranquility to turmoil and back to a new, stronger peace, is what would make the story so compelling and memorable. It's a journey that resonates with anyone who has ever felt wronged by an abuse of power and dreamed of a just and final resolution. The story serves as a powerful inspirational narrative, a modern-day fable of David versus Goliath set in a suburban landscape. Nick represents the common man, the blue-collar everyman who values hard work, integrity, and heritage. Martha is the stand-in for every petty tyrant, every entitled bully who uses their perceived status as a weapon. The story's appeal lies in its demonstration that the system, while often slow and frustrating, can work. It shows that meticulous preparation, knowledge, and a refusal to sink to the bully's level are the most effective weapons. Nick's victory is inspirational because it is achievable. He doesn't have superpowers. His power is his competence, his patience, and his deep-seated knowledge of his community. He inspires the audience to believe that they, too, can stand up to the Marthas in their own lives by being smarter, more prepared, and having the right on their side. The story ends not just with the defeat of a villain, but with the restoration and improvement of a community, leaving the audience with a feeling of hope and empowerment. It's a reminder that one person, standing firm on their own patch of ground, can indeed make a world of difference. Nick's decision to involve the police from the moment the conflict escalated from harassment to a criminal threat was a masterstroke of strategy. By filing a formal report, he transformed a personal dispute into an official matter of record. This had several key effects. First, it established a legal paper trail, proving he had sought resolution through proper channels. Second, it provided him with a layer of protection. If Martha were to escalate further, her actions would be viewed by the authorities as retaliation against a citizen who had filed a complaint, a far more serious offense. Third, and most importantly, it allowed for the police presence during the final confrontation to be entirely justified and procedural. Chief Frank and his officers weren't there as Nick's personal enforcers. They were there, in their official capacity, to keep the peace while other city departments enforced documented legal and code violations that had been discovered through legitimate means. This adherence to protocol stripped Martha of any potential claim that she was being unfairly targeted by a corrupt mayor. Nick didn't use the police as a weapon. He used the law as a shield, and the police were simply the guardians of that shield, ensuring that the law could be served safely and effectively. The final scene, from Nick's distant vantage point, was a silent movie of justice. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the story in the body language. He saw Martha's initial, aggressive posture, her hands on her hips, her chin jutted out in a display of defiance. He watched it crumble as she was presented with the undeniable, tangible evidence of her transgressions. The sheaf of papers from code enforcement, the thick envelope from the tax office. These were not flimsy, cream-colored notices from a phantom HOA. This was the real thing. He saw her point, her jaw working, probably trying to use the same condescending tone that had always worked for her. And he saw the wall of calm, professional impassivity she came up against. The city officials and police officers didn't argue. They didn't engage. They simply presented the facts. Her power had always been derived from her victims' unwillingness to fight back, their fear of confrontation. But here was a foe that could not be intimidated, that would not back down, because it wasn't a person, it was the system itself. And as he watched her retreat, defeated, into her oversized house, Nick knew he had witnessed more than just a personal victory. He had witnessed the simple, elegant, and crushing triumph of reality over delusion. The details of Martha's illegal business, once uncovered, painted a clear picture of her arrogance. She called herself a synergy and lifestyle consultant, a meaningless title that allowed her to charge exorbitant fees to wealthy clients for vague advice on home organization and personal branding. She held client meetings in her home, a direct violation of zoning for a residential-only property. Her website, which Nick found with a simple online search, listed her home address as her corporate headquarters. She had created a limited liability company, or LLC, with the state, giving her a veneer of legitimacy, but she had never taken the required steps of getting a local business license or registering with the city tax office. It was a classic case of someone believing that online registration was all that was required and that local laws were for lesser mortals. She was, in effect, operating a ghost business within the city limits, using city services like roads and infrastructure while contributing nothing to their upkeep. It was this parasitic existence, this profound disrespect for the community she claimed to want to elevate, that made her downfall so richly deserved. Her attempt to extort a few $100s from Nick ended up exposing a fraudulent operation worth tens of thousands in unpaid taxes and fines. The support of the rallied community became a crucial element, not just for the legal case, but for the moral victory. When Nick first approached the other neighbors, he saw the fear in their eyes. Martha had successfully created a climate of intimidation. They were afraid that speaking out would only bring more harassment, but by showing them his own file, by explaining that the mayor's office and the police were taking this seriously, he offered them a shield. He didn't just ask for their help, he offered them his protection. This act of solidarity is what broke the dam. One by one, they came forward, their anger finally outweighing their fear. Their collected stories painted a devastating portrait of a serial bully. The fines for garden gnomes and swing sets, which seemed merely petty on their own, became a clear pattern of criminal harassment when viewed together. This collective evidence transformed the case from a personal vendetta into a public service. Nick was no longer just fighting for his own property. He was a champion for an entire neighborhood that had been silenced by a tyrant. Their willingness to stand with him gave him the moral authority to see the fight through to the end. The epilogue provided the ultimate narrative satisfaction. It wasn't enough for Martha to just be stopped. The audience needed to see the complete and final consequences of her actions. The for sale sign was the first visual confirmation of her defeat. The news of her financial ruin, struggling to pay a massive tax bill, and the fines for her code violations was the karmic justice for her attempted extortion. The story of the new family moving in and becoming friends with Nick showed the restoration of peace and neighborliness. But the most important part of the epilogue was the transformation of the community, seeing the neighbors come together for a potluck, reclaiming their public spaces, and forming a real, supportive community group was the true victory. It demonstrated that the removal of a toxic element can allow for health and growth. The story didn't just end with the punishment of a villain. It ended with the birth of a better, stronger community. This uplifting resolution is what elevated the narrative from a simple revenge story to an inspirational tale about the power of standing up, the importance of community, and the enduring strength of quiet, principled resolve. In the end, Nick's specific expertise wasn't as an electrician, but as a systems thinker. Whether it was a house's electrical grid or a city's legal code, he understood how complex systems worked. He knew that everything was connected, and that a problem in one area could often be solved by applying pressure in another. Martha saw their conflict as a simple, linear battle of wills. Nick saw it as a network of interconnected vulnerabilities. She attacked him on the front of property rights, so he examined the wiring of her business dealings. He found shoddy work unlicensed, untaxed, unzoned. He didn't just push back against her attack. He went to the source of her power, her finances, and flipped the main breaker. This methodical, almost analytical approach to problem-solving was his superpower. It was the lifetime of experience, as a master tradesman applied to the world of municipal law. He didn't need to be a brilliant lawyer or a tough guy cop. He just needed to be who he was. A man who understood how things were supposed to work, and who had the patience and the skill to fix them when they were broken. The title of mayor was, in the end, almost incidental. Nick could have accomplished much of the same investigation as a private citizen. Public records are public, police reports can be filed by anyone, and city departments are obligated to investigate credible complaints. However, his position did grant him two key advantages: access and credibility. When he called the city attorney or the chief of police, they answered immediately. His requests were taken seriously from the outset, without the skepticism that a regular citizen might initially face. His title opened doors and streamlined the process, allowing him to gather the necessary information quickly and efficiently. But he was careful never to abuse that power. He never ordered anyone to do anything. He made requests, filed official reports, and followed the same procedures any other resident would have to follow. His power was not in his title, but in his knowledge of how to use the system correctly. The title was a key that unlocked the tools. But his skill as a strategist and a man of integrity was what ultimately won the war. He proved that true power isn't about the position you hold, but about how honorably and effectively you use the authority you've been given. Martha's final, lingering image in the town's memory was of the moving truck. On a grey, drizzly morning, a large truck pulled up to her faux Tuscan villa. A small, sullen crew began loading her life into boxes. She was seen only once, a fleeting figure in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. There was no defiant glare, no final condescending speech. She was just a woman who had lost everything because she had been unwilling to concede a single inch of ground she had no right to in the first place. Her departure was as quiet and anonymous as her arrival had been loud and ostentatious. The neighborhood didn't celebrate. They simply went on with their lives, the air noticeably lighter. Her house, once a symbol of oppressive authority, was just a house again, waiting for a new family to fill it with laughter instead of legal notices. Nick watched the moving truck pull away, its diesel engine a low rumble in the quiet morning. He felt no joy, no pity. He just felt a sense of closure. The faulty circuit had been removed from the system. The power had been restored, and his lake was, once again, just his lake. Peaceful, private, and finally, indisputably, his. Years later, Nick would be sitting on his porch with his grandchildren, teaching them the names of the birds that nested by the lake. His time as mayor was long over, and he had returned fully to his life as a quiet, retired craftsman. The story of the HOA queen had faded into the comfortable fabric of local law. a tale told to newcomers as a cautionary example of why it was a good idea to be a good neighbor in this town. Looking out over the water, shimmering in the afternoon sun, Nick felt a profound sense of peace. The battle with Martha had been a defining moment, a test of his patience and his principles. He had been pushed, and he had pushed back, not with anger, but with the steady, unyielding force of the law. He had protected his heritage, defended his community, and reaffirmed his belief in a simple, guiding principle: that a person's home is their castle, and no petty tyrant, no matter how loud or self-important, has the right to lay siege to it. And as his granddaughter pointed excitedly at a turtle sunning itself on a log, Nick knew that this peace, this simple, beautiful moment, was what he had been fighting for all along. It was a victory that would last a lifetime,